Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your interest in this new event organized by the Observatorio de la Lengua Española y las Culturas Hispánicas en los Estados Unidos, which is another very special event we are devoting to Spanish classical music in the current academic year. And we are privileged to have as guest speakers today two widely acclaimed professionals in their respective fields, journalist Philip Bennett and conductor Ángel Gil-Ordóñez, who are also longtime friends and who will hold an interview conversation about the important and innovative work carried out by Ángel Gil-Ordóñez in the last 2 decades, bringing in Spanish classical music and classical music from other contexts in very new forms to American audiences. Let me first introduce Philip Bennett to you, which is a real honor for me to do so. And then Philip will introduce Ángel Gil-Ordóñez to you before they start off their conversation. Philip Bennett is a journalist, documentary film producer, and teacher. He actually holds a degree from Harvard University, where we are located, as you know. He has spent more than 30 years as a foreign correspondent, newspaper editor, and television journalist. But he started his journalism career in Lima, in Peru, in 1982 with the Lima Times. Later, he became foreign correspondent for the Boston Globe in Latin America, covering Mexico and Central America during the 1980s. His work has appeared in many publications, including Vanity Fair, The Atlantic, and El País in Spain, where he actually published a very important article back in 2010 titled Retrato de un País en Crisis, which had a huge repercussion then. Bennett was also, after working for the Boston Globe, he became the managing editor of the Washington Post for 4 years, a post which he occupied for 4 years. And in this period, the newspaper won 10 Pulitzer Prizes. He then became the editor for foreign news, also for the Post, after the attack of September 11 in 2001. And he then directed the paper's global coverage, including the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. As a documentary film producer, Philip Bennett has produced 20 films on American politics and national security for the PBS documentary series Frontline, directing programs such as one called Divided States of America in 2017, or the very important program The Choice in 2016, which won an Emmy Award, and more recently, America's Great Divide from Obama to Trump in 2020. I will just finish by saying that for 11 years, Philip Bennett worked as a professor of journalism and public policy at Duke University. So thank you, Philip. It's a real pleasure to have you here. And you have the floor now to introduce Ángel and start off your fascinating conversation. I'm sure it's going to be fascinating. Thank you very much and welcome to the Observatorio. Welcome both of you to the Observatorio.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you very for that generous introduction. It's wonderful to be here in the Observatorio. Marta and I are sitting 2 offices apart. It's the first time I've been here. It's a wonderful venue, and I'm happy to be here. I want to thank the Observatorio for inviting us to have this conversation, and thank all of you for joining us today. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined. I see from his office at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., to be joined by my dear friend, Ángel Gil-Ordóñez. It's wonderful to see you. Hola, maestro.
Queridísimo Phil, it's a great honor to be with all of you here today. I mean, what a pleasure. Apparently, we are going to talk for 1 hour. Somebody will have to throw us something at some point because we can keep going for 3 or 4 days.
I think we have on other occasions. Our main topic today is Spanish music in America, but you'll see we'll take a few detours, slight detours that reflect the range of interests, ideas, and insights that Ángel brings to this subject. And in addition to our conversation, Ángel has chosen several musical excerpts that will play over the course of the hour that illustrate parts of the journey that he's taken audiences on over the last decades. Before we get started, I will say a few words of introduction to try to describe part of Ángel's own professional journey, which is fascinating. Ángel was born in Madrid. He studied at the Madrid Conservatory of Music, while at the same time earning an engineering degree at the Universidad Politécnica. With that stable and secure career path ahead of him, he instead chose a vocation in music. In 1985, he moved to Munich to study with his mentor, the Romanian conductor Sergiu Celibidache. Ángel returned to Madrid as an associate conductor of the National Symphony Orchestra of Spain. In 1997, he moved to Washington, D.C., and a few years later, co-founded the Post-Classical Ensemble with the music historian Joe Horowitz. The Washington Post has called the Post-Classical Ensemble, quote, one of the country's most innovative musical groups. Although Ángel has championed music from around the globe, he has often featured Spanish composers largely unfamiliar to American audiences. In 2006, the King of Spain awarded Ángel the Royal Order of Queen Isabella, the country's highest civilian decoration, for advancing Spanish culture around the world. Of his 9 recordings, 4 albums are devoted to Spanish composers. Today, Ángel is the music director and conductor of the Post-Classical Ensemble and principal guest conductor of New York's Perspectives Ensemble. He is also musical director of the Georgetown University Orchestra. So Ángel, to start, I've wondered before even this conversation, if there was a moment when you said to yourself the unlikely words, I want to be a conductor. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you could describe for us when and how music took hold of your imagination as a young person.
Sure. So I was that kid that was always asked in the family reunions to sing, which I hated. I had a very good voice. And Angelito has to sing, This is how I all started. I was 3 years old and I had to sing in all these family reunions. I hated that. But at the same time, I loved it because I felt, when I'm singing, this is something special is happening. So in the school, I started learning. My first instrument actually was the accordion and the guitar when I was like 6, 7 years old in the school. And then I went to study violin with a phenomenal private teacher. But the epiphany, the revelation, was actually when I was 20 years old. April 1978, comes to Madrid conducting the London Symphony Orchestra, a very strange conductor who had a terrible reputation because he had terrible temper, but he was a genius. And I said, oh, let's go there. I mean, there were no recording of this conductor because he actually refused to record music. I went there and it was the epiphany, Phil. That was the moment in which I said, I never heard an orchestra sounding like that. Everything, the transparency, the tension, the colors, the intensity, the unit. I said, what is this? So I thought to myself, I'm not ready. I have to be very well prepared for that, but this is going to be my teacher. And that happened, several years later. I was there in Munich studying with them. So that was the epiphany. Sergiu Celibidache with the London Symphony was, I would never forget that. Romeo and Julia by Prokofiev.
I was going to ask you what it was. Yes.
It was incredible.
So you're established as a young conductor in Europe, and you decide to come to the United States in 1990.
93, we arrived in December 6, 1993, we arrived to New York.
And what was behind that decision?
It was love what brought me to the United States. So I met this wonderful woman in Madrid when I was living at the Residencia de Estudiantes, who was the press attaché of the Mexican embassy, Adriana Gomez. And she calls me one day crying. The Secretary of Foreign Affairs had just called me and has told me that I have to move to New York. And I said, don't cry, let's go. So I was finishing my contract with the National Symphony as associate conductor. I had never been in the United States. And I said, this is a great opportunity. You know, I had engagements for 2 seasons conducting in Europe and in Spain. I said, let's go. I can go back and forth. So love brought me to the United States. And 30 years later, we are still here and we love it.
So you and Adriana you arrive in Washington, D.C. And arriving in Washington, D.C., you decide to start with Joe, you decide to start an orchestra.
Yep.
And this seems like another leap of faith. You know, Washington already had a fine symphony. And although it had a history of music that included Duke Ellington and others, it was never thought to be or seen as a city very hospitable to innovation in the performing arts. And at the same time, you're doing this at a time when audiences are not flocking to concert halls to hear classical music. So what were you thinking when, 20 years ago, you started the Post-Classical Ensemble? What did you want to create?
Yes, so I had the privilege and the fortune to meet music historian Joe Horowitz when he was the executive director of the Brooklyn Philharmonic in New York. And I was very interested in the way he understood programming concerts. And then a casual visit to Washington from New York to visit actually a mutual friend, the former director of Del País, Antonio Caño. We arrived to Union Station, and then it was also another revelation. A beautiful restaurant with candles, coming from Penn Station in New York. And then just you exit Union Station and you see the Capitol illuminated. It was like, my goodness, this is a fantastic place. So in the meantime, in New York, I had met some musicians in Washington, members of the Washington Opera. And, New York and Washington in 96 was not the Washington of today. I think probably Washington is the city in the United States that has had a more incredible evolution in the last 20 years. So in 1926, as you say, we had the wonderful work of the National Symphony. There was the Baltimore Symphony. It was the Opera House. And then, of course, an incredible tradition of chamber music in Washington. Probably the most important chamber music series in the United States, Library of Congress, National Gallery of Art, Phillips Collection. So I felt there is a niche here for a chamber orchestra with new ideas, with an innovative chamber orchestra. Whereas in New York, you are competing with everybody, even with the bus driver. So I thought, this is the place, because at that point, I already knew that my career had to be established here in the United States. That was the other revelation in 94. So the reason was mainly a practical reason. And of course, something very important. In Washington, we have a highly, highly educated audience. I mean, this is one of the places in the United States where the level of education is high. So I felt this is a place where an audience will be challenged and be able to actually receive this. Because one of the things I learned from friends I knew in Washington is well, we go to New York or to other places to listen to music or to other more innovative things. So that was the revelation was in 97 was precisely that.
So how did you, that's the place, but what was the idea? So how did you want to challenge people? What if you wanted to innovate, what was the innovation that you wanted to see come to life?
Exactly. So to me, what always obsessed me about attendance to classical music is, I mean, of course, you know, there is always an obsession in every arts organization in bringing young people. And of course, this is great. This is very, very important. But to me, it was more important to see, I mean, my friends who loved film, Pasolini, or who loved art, good to abstract art, loved to art galleries, that went to theater, to listen to a Shakespeare play that might be even 3-4 hours. And then why these people don't come to a concert? So what was behind that? That they didn't approach the musical experience live, the live musical experience. And then I thought, and that was of course conversations with Joe, it's not the music that don't attract people, it's the format of the music. So what is happening nowadays, and I respect that immensely because there is an audience for that, is that the format of presenting classical music hasn't evolved in the last 200 years, which is you go to a performance and you are exposed to a Mozart overture, a concerto with a soloist, there is an intermission, and there is a big symphony. So this is the regular format in every symphony orchestra. There is an audience for that, and it's wonderful that this model stays. But this is not attracting all the people that I am mentioning, because people that go to a film of Pasolini don't relate to Mahler specifically just for the fact of listening to Mahler. But how do you create a way to engage these people? So what actually is lacking in this format is the contextualization, the putting the things together. So why Mahler is so great? And this is actually what post-classical ensemble does. So we bring these elements that enhance the experience of a piece that we love. To give you an example. So in the end, we are telling a story. This is actually what post-classical ensemble does, which is the American way of educating. And that was one of the things that I have learned in this country. You have to tell a beautiful story. There are beautiful stories in music. For instance, in 1889, Claude Debussy visits in Paris the Universal Exhibit. And he listens for the first time an Indonesian gamelan, which is the traditional music from Indonesia. And that changed, that was his epiphany. It changed completely the way he understood traditional Western music. He listened to pentatonic music, he listened to resonances that he would never imagine. And that changed completely the way he understood music from then on. So we told that story. How do we tell that story? So we were the resident orchestra in the cathedral. So what we did, I put the orchestra in the middle of the Washington National Cathedral. And we had a Javanese gamelan on one part of the nave, a Balinese gamelan on the other part of the nave. And then the orchestra performing music by composers that were influenced by that tradition. Not only Debussy, Ravel, Americans like Lou Harrison, Canadians like Colin McPhee, French like Olivier Messiaen. So we told that story in a performance. So this is the way we work. We tell beautiful stories and we contextualize the experience. And then I can tell you that the audience comes out saying, you were there. The sound of the gamelans and then the orchestra, that dialogue, it was really fascinating.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Ángel. And that leads us, I think what we'll do now is we'll go through some different examples and we have some excerpts and of different ways that you've told stories through performances, many of them involving more than just watching music being performed. And I wanted to start, we talked about this before. I think it's the first performance that that I attended, and it might have been just when the orchestra was started. So it's 2003, it was December of 2003. And this was a performance at Georgetown. And I think the larger context was just after the second anniversary of 9/11. The Iraq War was a couple of months old. The Afghan War was going on. At the time, I was the editor of the Washington Post in charge of coverage of those wars. I felt very immersed in that world. And I think many of us remember that for a big part of this country, but more widely too, it was a real time of fear and anger, and it was heavy with a sense in parts of the country that there was a clash of civilizations unfolding, or at least being pursued by different interests around the world. So the program that you put on had the relatively innocent title, Iberian Mystics, right? And it presented Spanish music from three faith traditions: Christian, Jewish, and Islamic. And I remember, in the same way that you described the gamelan concert in the National Cathedral, I remember the audience being just transfixed. And because I think in a very subtle way, using Spanish or using the music of Spain, you told an old and enduring story of the interdependency of cultures and common cultural influences flowing through that music. Now, that was a story that had painful chapters of its own, but it created a context, a kind of pathway towards understanding. And you must remember that concert.
Absolutely. That was actually, Phil, that was the first season of post-classical ensemble, and the first performance of that season. We are celebrating 20 years next season. It was our season 2003-2004. And as you say, there was a very, very difficult moment for everybody. And we thought, I mean, what a better way to bring hope than giving this example of coexistence for so many centuries. I mean, not easy coexistence, as you said, but it happened. It happened in Spain. It happened in Spain that rites like from Judaism to Catholicism were actually done in the same place, in the same church. You go to Toledo, you go to Cordoba, and you see that confluences. And we told that story. And actually, we had we had, of course, not only the music, but the poetry of the time. We recited poems by Juan de la Cruz and Teresa de Avila. And in the part of the Sephardic influence, we had, only in the United States, we had in Falls Church, Virginia, a Sephardic singer that was, unbelievable, Flori Jagoda. And I learned that, and I brought her there. And I was in her home, and I still get ghost camp. You know what she showed me in her home? The keys of the family in Spain. They kept the keys of the homes in Spain after 500 years in their home. I mean, I still get goosebumps. So this lady was singing in Ladino Sephardic songs. And of course, we had the confluence with Manuel de Falla too. So we explored, and we also had a wonderful oud player, bringing also the Arabic component. So it was kind of a gathering for hope. And I remember we were terrified. It was December 3, 2003, the first snow in Washington, which is the worst thing that can happen. And we thought nobody was going to come. We had 700 people in Gaston Hall. It was full house. It was unbelievable. And I thought it was, I agree with you, Phil, it was something that was needed at the moment. Let's get together and let's. That was a beautiful experience.
Well, let's play our first excerpt, and it is from Manuel de Falla, because you used Manuel de Falla to tie together those different traditions. And,
Absolutely.
so we're going to listen to a brief excerpt from El Amor Brujo, a piece that you've recorded, you've played many times, and we're going to return to a little bit later in our conversation. So do you want to set up just briefly what we're going to listen to here? Whoops, before we hear it.
Yes, I think we're going to listen to the introduction of Amor Brujo. It's a very beautiful ballet. Of course, a love story between Roma, two Roma young people. And this is the overture, which is kind of a fanfare, something that Falla liked very much. It's also a very medieval. We will go back to this when we talk about other music by Falla. And this is the introduction of the ballet. This is the sea from Cádiz. Manuel de Falla was from Cádiz, and this is the sea in Cádiz. And the sounds of the night.
So, Ángel, why is Manuel de Falla so important to you, and why has it been so important to you to incorporate him into so much of what the classical ensemble's done?
Manuel de Falla is specifically El Amor Brujo is a piece that somehow has a very importance in my career. This is actually the first music I conducted in the United States. In 1994, I was engaged by the Joyce Theater in New York to record this ballet, the original version of the ballet, which is the one we were listening to 1915, for a performance of a flamenco company that actually was based in Santa Fe. Maria Benitez was the leader of that company. So that was my entrance to the United States. I mean, months after arrival, again, only in the United States, there is somebody that knows somebody, there is a Spanish conductor, you have to do this. And that was That was my introduction to the United States. And even, imagine, what never happens. The New York Times mentioned the recording in the review. So I said, I have to be here. You are heard here. In this country, your work has an impact. So anyway, Falla has been, first of all, because there is no doubt that he's the most important composer of the first half of the 20th century. And his influence, not only as a composer, but also as a mentor of a complete generation, was crucial. So he was an international composer. He went to Paris. He established in Paris himself in 1907. The moment that Paris was the center of the world, he made friends with everybody inimaginable there that was there, from Igor Stravinsky to, of course, his teacher, Dukas, Debussy, Ravel. He was an international, he was a universal soul. And then, because of the war, he returned to Spain in 1914. And actually, this is the first piece that he writes when he arrives in Spain. He is actually commissioned this piece for a very important flamenco dancer and singer at the time, Pastora Imperio. And he writes this piece for her in a chamber version, 14 instruments, very much in the style of Stravinsky, in the tendency at the time. And what is very interesting is that actually Falla, why Falla goes to the vernacular, so to say. Well, Falla studied with an extraordinary composer in Barcelona, Felipe Pedrell, before going to Paris, and he was always in contact with them, Felipe Pedrell. And Pedrell told him what the sources of inspiration for a composer are mainly two. One is the vernacular, your roots, your origins, the popular, and the other is your history. So Falla embraced the vernacular first. And actually this recording is done with a flamenco singer, with Esperanza Fernandez, because that was the original version. Pastora Imperio was dancing and singing at the same time. I don't know how she did that, but anyway, it was unbelievable. So El Amor Brujo is the fruit of this first idea of the vernacular. Something very important too. At that time, at the turn of the century, intellectuals are obsessed with the idea of how to be modern and at the same time how to find your national identity. What is Spanish music? What is French music? What is a Czech music? What is American music? This is a general obsession, intellectual, especially music, but in all the arts. And that's the reason that Falla embraces the vernacular first. And then he returns to the history later. And he goes back to what made Spain this big, of course, the Golden Age, Cervantes, the Spanish.
So we're gonna get to that. That's what's so interesting to say this now. And I would just say for those listening that we're actually gonna see that in a couple of minutes, because we're going to get to his work that's a homage drawn from Don Quixote, and it represents a different style.
Exactly.
Let me interrupt you just a little bit to say, or to ask, so you've said that it was important to you to have this music played by American players for American audiences. And so why does that matter? Why would that have been important?
This is, to me, this is something crucial that I actually learned both in my time studying in Germany and also in the United States. When you arrive as an outsider to a different country and you want to convey your culture, first of all, it's an extraordinary process that I think is very important for every young person in the world to arrive to a place that is new to you. I almost didn't speak the language. That doesn't mean that I speak the language now, but anyway, I always say that I speak Spanish in 5 languages anyway. But This idea of when you arrive, you listen to things, and you open your eyes and you absorb. This is, to me, very, very important. But at the same time, you listen to the reflection of your culture in the Americans, which I think is as important. So you discover yourself through the eyes of people that are not familiar with your culture. And to me, that's fascinating, because this brings spontaneity. So a culture is very important that we have that. We talk about tradition, but tradition can be a problem too, because tradition creates things that are not really spontaneous, that lost a character with the time. And then when you arrive to a different country and you play this music to different eyes, different ears, you learned a lot of things, because the tradition has told you, oh, this is how it has to be done. No. And then somebody from New Mexico or the New York Philharmonic plays this, like the musicians that we heard. And you learned a lot because you let them play and they absorb the music differently. And this is why this recording makes me so proud, because this is an Amor Brujo, a Spain through American eyes. And I can tell you that every time that I do music with my musicians in Washington, everybody tells me, how is it possible that this music is not performed always and more? And the Americans have to perform it. Americans have to have the experience, to experience it through their eyes and their senses, and they realize this is great. I mean, it's wonderful, to listen to a German orchestra performing German repertoire, but Brahms has an extraordinary component when it's played by an American or a Spanish orchestra. It has to be well done, of course.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So we had not planned any product placement in this conversation, but I will say that the Amor Brujo that you just listened to is a compact disc that's available, I assume, through where compact discs are sold. And you could probably also find it on the way to it through either the Naxos site or the Post-Classical Ensemble site, correct?
Well, you can, it's even easier than that. You will just go to Spotify and you can listen to the whole thing.
I'm trying to earn some revenue here for the, anyway. I think one of the ways that you said this I found so engaging was that you said that the key was to get foreign musicians to poner sus manos en la masa.
Exactly.
Which means roughly in English to get their hands dirty, but to really get in there and touch the music. Let's move on to another performance, because I think one of the things that distinguished the Post-Classical Ensemble from the beginning, not the only orchestra that does this, but certainly in Washington it would seem new, which was to play the film scores of films to a live audience as the film was rolling. And I remember going to a very memorable performance of the 1936 film Redes, that was shot by Paul Strand to a score by Silvestre Revueltas.
Exactly.
And that you performed live in front of an audience, and then later a remastered version of that film with the score that performed by Post-Classical, right? Was issued, a wonderful DVD that I'd encourage people to watch because it's just a revolutionary film. And you described Revueltas as the I think I read somewhere as the best composer you've never heard of. So maybe you could set up what your attraction to this film, to this music was, and then we'll see a clip from it.
Well, I'm from Madrid, and we're very exaggerated, and we say we're always exaggerating things. But it is true that to me, Silvestre Revueltas is probably one of the most extraordinary Latin American composers in the 20th century. There is no doubt. So this project is actually right up the alley of what we were talking about. How do we engage film lovers to come to listen to a music that they don't know? And it's a beautiful story, actually, and I'm very happy that my dear friend Alberto Fierro is here, because we owe them a beautiful presentation of this DVD in the beautiful Mexican Cultural Institute in Washington. Thank you, Alberto. So this is a fascinating moment, actually, not only in Latin America, but also in the United States. In 1936, this film is actually probably the most extraordinary example of cultural exchange between Mexico and the United States. So imagine a film that is the first film by Fred Zinnemann, the famous Viennese film director that later ended up in Hollywood, with probably the most extraordinary American photographer of the time, Paul Strand, with the music by Silvestre Revueltas, and everything paid by the government, which is another incredible thing. This is a New Deal phenomenon that has repercussions in the New Deal, in the American New Deal. Paul Strand goes to the United States and creates extraordinary documentaries for the American administration, the plow that broke the plains, the river, and later the city. So this is a very important moment in which the government is obsessed with the idea of, it's the best example of propaganda, you know? And then the music by Revueltas, which is, I mean, we're going to listen to some excerpts there. So, but anyway, these 30s are both in Mexico and the United States crucial. Probably our audience know about these documentaries, The Plow That Broke the Plains and the River, in which they are showing how difficult was the moment in the United States, the problem of the floodings of the Mississippi River, the devastation of the plains, which is all the Dust Bowl, and the government engages intellectuals and artists to create documentaries to be shown all over the United States. Music by Virgil Thompson, and music by Aaron Copland, and of course the photography by Paul Strand.
So let's watch this excerpt. We're not so happy with the fidelity of this image. It's from streaming on YouTube, so you're going to see it's a little jumpy, but you'll get a sense of it. Ángel, yeah, feel free to speak over the music too, as you did.
Sure,
it's really helpful. So let's hear it, Joseph.
So why I'm exaggerating saying that Revueltas is such a great composer? Well, because I feel that he's the best representation of what we talk from Manuel de Falla. Revueltas is the representation of the music of Mexico, the music of the streets, the popular music, the vernacular. He's an extraordinary, like nobody else. And he was spontaneous. He was a very troubled soul. But this music is, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating in the images. The reason we did the DVD, it was a wonderful serendipity. Martin Scorsese considers Redes one of the best films in the history of film. He actually picked 7 films, and he included Redes, and he restored completely the print, the original print. And then what happened? The original soundtrack was terrible. Was clearly, I mean, probably Revueltas had one rehearsal, they did it, it sounds like hell. And it really made a disservice to the music of Revueltas. So that was the moment to present the score with quality. And you listen to this music, it's absolutely fascinating. There is a funeral scene. I mean, the film is really, well, as you know, it's a struggle between the fishermen and the owners of the boats, and there is the main character who is the person who starts the first image we see, Miro. He loses a child because he has no money to pay, etc. There's an incredible funeral music. This is very Malerian. But what fascinates me, and actually is beautiful in the film, is when they are working, they are smiling. Isn't that beautiful? This guy has lost his child, and in the end, this is a wonderful song about community, about work, and it's really, really very, very moving.
Mm. You've mentioned Virgil Thompson and Lou Harrison, and you have featured American composers who are not as well known as some of the sort of canon of, classical music as performed by big symphonies, big orchestras. And another person is Bernard Herrmann, and we're going to move now to a different format that you've done. And I'm going to move a little quickly because of time, because we're going to move to Lorca and de Falla again. But so more than a decade ago, you and Joe decided to really devote the ensemble to an American roots program. So you've performed a lot of African-American music by African-American composers in a majority African-American city like Washington, D.C., a place where this was sorely, sorely missing. So there've been a lot of texture and depth to the programming that you've done. What we're going to listen to next is a really curious thing because it was a radio performance, correct? By
Exactly.
Bernard Herrmann, scoring Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. And if you could just describe who Bernard Herrmann was, because he's a colorful figure, and what we're going to listen to, and we'll hear a brief excerpt of Leaves of Grass with a score by Bernard Herrmann.
Well, Bernard Herrmann had the terrible idea of creating wonderful music for the films by Hitchcock. So he wrote a lot of music for the concert hall that nobody knew. And he was an extraordinary composer. But actually, this example is how he started his career as a composer. He started doing the music for these radio plays. Actually, the play is by one of the most important playwrights at the time for radio, Norman Corwin, who wrote all the beautiful narrative. And there was a series of Americana, so to say. And of course, if you talk about America, you have to talk about Walt Whitman. So that was one of his first compositions for radio. And I think it's already all the Herrmann that you listen later is right there. This, with very few means, he's able to convey an extraordinary quality in harmonic sound, a character. Let's listen to the clip.
I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars, and the pismire is equally perfect, and a grain of sand, and the egg of the wren, and the running blackberry would adorn the parlors of heaven. And the narrowest hinge in my hand puts to scorn all machinery, and the cow crunching with depressed head surpasses any statue. And the mouse is miracle enough to stagger sextillions of infidels.
Are there a lot of miracles?
Whether I walk the streets of Manhattan or wade with naked feet along the beach just in the edge of the water, or stand under trees in the woods, or talk by day with anyone I love, or sleep in the bed at night with anyone I love, or sit at table at dinner with the rest, or look at strangers opposite me riding in the car, or watch honeybees busy around the hive of a summer afternoon, or animals feeding in the fields, or birds, or the wonderfulness of insects in the air, or the wonderfulness of the sundown, or the stars shining so quiet and bright. What stranger miracles are there?
It's such an amazing piece, and it's such an amazing poem. And if you put that, Joseph, put that photo up there just for one more second of Walt Whitman. I just looking at that photo there, I wanted to mention, many Latin American poets wrote odes to Walt Whitman, Neruda, Rubén Darío, and of course Lorca wrote Ode to Walt Whitman. And if you're familiar with that poem or you want to go read it after this presentation, just look at that photograph of Walt Whitman and you'll know exactly what inspired Federico García Lorca to write the poem that he did.
Absolutely.
And also just what you mentioned earlier, Ángel, about the kind of alchemy between a popular voice and a traditional voice, creating something original. I think I hadn't made this connection before we talked about this, and read the Lorca poem again about these cross currents of culture. Obviously, of course, they flow in both directions, right? So you have American artists like Walt Whitman having a profound influence on somebody like Federico García Lorca, who wrote that poem while he was at Columbia University in New York. So it's a wonderful exchange. Maybe we'll segue a little bit to talk about another kind of exchange, and we're just going to touch on this briefly. But I wanted to, because you were asked in October by the go with musicians from the ensemble to perform at the opening of the exhibition of John Singer Sargent's paintings called Sargent and Spain, which it was in the National Gallery and now going to San Francisco for a few months. And let's see the picture, Joseph, if you have that.
I believe.
Yeah, so there's Ángel at the opening with La Carmencita, John Singer Sargent, and the influence. We're in the Boston area, so we those of us here can go across the river and see Sargent's painting El Jaleo at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and see the other. Once you read that he spent months painting in El Prado of Velázquez, and then you go see his paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts or the Gardner Museum, and you can see that influence there. But touch on, you played Manuel de Falla there too, right?
We did because it's so interesting. This is another, to me, the figure of the outsider is crucial. The person that comes from a different culture and then sees things with different eyes. And this is the experience of Sargent. He went to Spain. Actually, he traveled so much to Spain. I didn't know that he was almost all over Spain. He was fascinated by especially two places. It's very interesting: the south of Spain and Mallorca.
Mm.
So, of course, when you visit, imagine at the time, I mean, we are talking about the 19th century, Granada, and he was exposed to the music and to the dances of flamenco, of the Roma there. And that was also an incredible experience for him. And of course, the popular music, the Carmencita, was not a Roma dancer, but there was also the tradition in Spain that came from many centuries of this flamenco influence in the court too. So there is a tradition of the boleros, de las sevillanas, etc. And that was an example, the Carmencita, of that. So Sargent was completely fascinated, of course, by the Alhambra. There are even pictures of him painting the Alhambra. And this is, again, the importance at the time of the vernacular, which is, I think it was very important for the intellectuals, of elevating the vernacular to the category of high culture.
Yes, well, and I think, I wonder how many wealthy Boston matrons of the period who had their portraits painted by John Singer Sargent recognized that he was modeling those portraits on flamenco dancers that he had painted in Spain years earlier. So let's stay in Granada. We're about to blow through our hour here, but it's for a good cause, and we're not that far from soliciting your questions. But we do want to pause on Granada in the 1920s, when Manuel de Falla and Garcia Lorca meet, form this extraordinary friendship. They're obviously aware of one another, but Garcia Lorca is only 22 years old and Falla is much older, and they get together to start this concurso de cante jondo, as a kind of way of, in their minds, of rescuing flamenco singing, which they thought was endangered. And they formed this friendship and this alliance. And this is, in some ways, it is the center of your next performance, which is going to be in April at the Kennedy Center. And anyone within shuttle distance of Washington, D.C., I'd strongly encourage you to try to go to this, because it's going to be extraordinary. But tell us first a little bit about that relationship between Manuel de Falla and Federico Garcia Lorca, and set up for us the last excerpt that we're going to hear from Manuel de Falla's extraordinary work. Was done for a puppet show based on an episode from Don Quixote, etc. See if you can take us through that as the last story like this we'll hear today.
Exactly. Well, you are talking, Phil, about one of the most extraordinary periods of Spanish culture, which is the early 1920s. Is a confluence of interesting things. Is Spain awakening from the terrible depression of losing the last colonies in 1898, and then the reaction is extraordinary. It's actually a very positive reaction. It's a positive to opening to be more universal. Intellectuals going to Paris as the center of the intellectual moment. And then, of course, Falla was there, as we mentioned. And then also there is the 300th anniversary of Luis de Góngora in 1927. So that is that time in which everybody's looking at the past as a reference, at the Siglo de Oro, at Cervantes, at the Spanish polyphony of the 16th century, at the wonderful keyboard school of the 18th century. You know, the past as a reference for inspiration. So Falla is actually kind of the mentor of all of them, of these young people. And Lorca he sees Falla as a mentor, as I said. You know, he comes from Paris, arrives back to to Granada, and they become inseparable, and they go again rescuing, as you said, with this idea of rescuing the vernacular as something very important to our culture, and they create this flamenco competition in 1922. Actually,
let's excuse me, Joseph. Let's see the photograph of them together.
yes.
While Angel's describing this.
So imagine if this is Granada in 1922. We have this picture. The first person on the left is Francisco García Lorca, the brother of Federico. Then is Antonio de Luna, and then Federico García Lorca in the middle. Then the first lady on the left is Mari Carmen de Falla, is the sister of Manuel de Falla. And in the middle is the extraordinary harpsichordist Wanda Landowska. Then Manuel de Falla, who was visiting Granada. So again, this idea of the exchange. Falla was in Paris, but Stravinsky came to Granada, to Madrid, to the Residencia de Estudiantes. Landowska come there. So there is this extraordinary exchange of ideas, of culture. And then the last person is a friend of Manuel de Falla, who was a lawyer, Jose Segura. So this is happening in Granada in 1922. Wanda Landowska, the most important harpsichordist at the time, is visiting Granada. Actually, it's very interesting because recently the epistolary, the correspondence between Falla and Wanda Landowska has been recently donated to the Library of Congress. It's there. And actually, Wanda Landowska's harpsichord is actually at the Library of Congress. So it's this fascinating moment in Spain in which everything is happening.
So talk to us about El Retablo, piece that you're going to perform, and how you're bringing Lorca and de Falla together in the performance that you're going to have in April.
So we are celebrating this year 100 years of, in my opinion, Manuel de Falla's masterpiece, which is Master Peter's Puppet Show. This is he wrote the piece in 1923, and this is de Falla forgetting a little bit about the vernacular and going to the history and going to Cervantes. This is a piece inspired in one of the chapters of Don Quixote, in which Don Quixote is on the street witnessing a street theater in which a beautiful story about Christian and Moors is told, a princess is kidnapped, and there is a persecution. Of course, he gets crazy and he destroys the whole thing. You know, it's a beautiful, one of the chapters of Don Quixote. So this is the inspiration of Falla, is the past, is what some have called also neoclassicism. The same way that Stravinsky was looking at Pergolesi for Pulcinella, Falla was looking at the medieval music for a Master Peter Puppet Show.
Joseph, let's see the next slide, please. Yeah.
Look at the beautiful illustration for the program. There was the piece actually was premiered in Paris. So you see that incredible constant exchange of work, and then you see the manuscript of the piece. Is an extraordinary piece that has all these reminiscences of Cervantes. There are three characters. Is the boy that is narrating the story, is the owner of the retablo, and then of course Don Quixote. So hopefully some of you can attend on April 19th. So how do we, going back to post-classical ensemble, how do we contextualize this piece? So we have commissioned a play to an extraordinary stage director and playwright, Derek Goldman, that is going to create a beautiful drama. Will be a conversation between Federico García Lorca and Manuel de Falla, telling precisely this story of how they met, how flamenco was the first style for the relationship, and how the relationship evolved, etc. So that will be the program in April 19th.
Wonderful. Well, let's hear the excerpt that and Ángel, would you want to say anything going into this at all?
Yes, it's we're going to listen to the overture. This is when Master Peter invites everybody to approach the theater, and the overture, which sounds like Renaissance music. I mean, with the language of the 20th century, which I think is extraordinary. You listen to the harpsichord there. Very Spanish, isn't it? Well, you know, that's the introduction. That's the introduction. Isn't that fascinating music? How he brings all these elements.
So just, I think we can stop there.
Yeah, we can stop there. Yeah.
Nothing makes me happier than seeing El Maestro reach for the baton. Just knowing what's coming, and already you have the music inside you. Well, I think this is a great place to pause. I just want to thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Oh my God, Phil, my great.
I've never felt as grateful for the epiphany that you had back when you were 20, which I think has resulted in innumerable epiphanies by other people.
Well,
I've
thank
been
you.
able to sit in the audience and listen to you perform. So thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Marta, and in the time remaining, I think we'll take questions, or Ángel will take questions.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the fascinating answers. Thank you, Joseph, as well, for the coordination, and thank you, the three of you, for the wonderful quality of the recordings. I know you've worked on it, and it's important in an event devoted to music. We would like to invite you all to ask questions or make comments, either through the chat in writing, and I'll read them out to both Philip and Ángel, or by asking them yourselves. Let me first, if you allow me, greet the Consul General of Mexico in Boston, Mr. Alberto Fierro, because I know, hello, Alberto, I know from what Ángel told us at the beginning of the conversation that, well, not just love, but Mexico was another reason that brought Ángel to the States. And I know that you were friends, and you had a relationship with cultural and professional while you were while Alberto was in Washington in those initial Washington years. So maybe you want to say hello to him too. I think you've mentioned him already. So thank you, Alberto, for being here.
No, thank you. What a pleasure. Thank you for organizing this, Marta. And Phil and Ángel, very great to see you again. Unfortunately, not in person, but what I do have to say that if Ángel has a love for the Falla, he has also mentioned his love for the Mexican music and how important it has been the role of Ángel to showcase Mexican concert music that is not well known in the US. So thank you so much, Ángel, for once again sharing. And that particular project of Redes is fantastic.
Gracias, Alberto.
And it gave me a lot of nostalgia to remember the concert with the Indonesian instruments. That was a fantastic event. Congratulations.
Thank you. As I just wanted to mention about the Redes that, as Phil said, we presented the film in a huge screen with the orchestra performing the soundtrack live. And that actually is a complete different experience. And of course, you know, in this vein of attracting a different audience. And it was, every time we have done it, everybody is absolutely fascinated by the experience.
Mhm. Thank you so much. So would anybody like to ask a question or make a comment? You can either raise your hands through.
I have a question.
Oh, good. Go ahead, Joseph.
So thank you both so much for this lovely conversation. Phil, as someone who spent a lot of time in the Spanish-speaking world, but an American, what is your relationship with this music, and how do you understand the Spanish-speaking world through this music?
Well, you know, Ángel has been such an important part of that. You can tell from this conversation that, you know, I'm not a musician. I don't have a background in classical music. I grew up loving classical music because of my father, principally. You know, I remember very distinctly all of the concerts that we went to in Washington, the time we spent together, the lectures and workshops that Ángel does around the concerts, which are integral to this. Ángel and I were talking about Leonard Bernstein and the young people's concerts of the 1950s and 60s, which were just sort of a beautiful kind of open popular workshop, and there was a format there. I think all of us, you know, especially if you're a jazz lover, if you love, you know, all the different forms of Latin music from Latin America, from Spain, you know, we're so profoundly influenced by that in the United States. I grew up in California, so everything from mariachi music to son to, you know, everything pours into you in such a way. And so what's been the joy of this is integrating classical music into your appreciation of popular, you know, Latin American Spanish influenced music that we've all grown up with in this country.
Thank you very much. There's somebody congratulating Ángel here from Naxos in Spain. Great music, great conductor. Naxos is so proud to have you as an artist. And this is Maria Cortina from Naxos in Español.
Hi, Ángel, congratulations.
Thank you, Maria, gracias.
No, we are really proud, as I just wrote you. Ángel has several albums with us, and we really, really appreciate his virtuosity and all his artistry.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a question myself for Ángel. I was really interested, and I completely agree with what you said about this, how we foreigners discover ourselves through the eyes of the new context. So how you would discover Spanish music through the eyes of the American audiences. So in relation to this, have you found that Americans have a different view of Spanish composers from, like, for example, where would they place Granados or Albeniz in relation to Falla? Do they view all these composers who are so important in Spain in a different way? Have you seen any differences in the way they regard these very important composers for us?
Absolutely. I can tell you that every time I have performed music that is not well known, Spanish music not well known in the United States, everybody has said, how is it possible that I don't know this music more? And this is actually why I insist in that American musicians play this music, because the only way to make this piece to be repeated is if an American orchestra says, we have to do this again, because it's important. So this is why, I mean, it's great that an orchestra from Spain comes and visits and plays Spanish repertoire in venues at the Lincoln Center or the Kennedy Center. But I think the impact is bigger if the Americans play it, because they will, I mean, that's a reality. I mean, every performance we have done with post-classical ensemble, our musicians and musicians in New York, they are performing that music in their for other performances, for in chamber music or even in symphonic repertoire.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that's why I insist in that. That I think is very, very important.
Thank you. We've got Carlos Ramos there, professor of Spanish from Wellesley College, and a good friend of yours as well. And I think he would like to ask something or make a comment.
Yeah, well,
Carlos,
first,
go ahead.
thank you, Marta, for such a treat today. I mean, 2 maestros for the price of 1. It was really engaging, and the way you kept the pace, Phil was phenomenal. I was lucky to meet Ángel and Adriana in a magical visit to Washington through Phil and Monica. So I have a great memory. And one of the things that I was thinking and that impressed me when I met you with all your charisma is that, of course, the transfer between Spain and the US in the musical world, in the art world, means that you also had to become an impresario. Because I think a big chunk of what you have to do here that is different from what your life would be in Spain is that you really have to do fundraising and interest people on your projects. So I would like to learn a little bit about that aspect of your work that maybe people in Spain don't think about that much.
And they should. So yes, I am the CEO of a company without wanting it. And that was a very difficult thing for me at the beginning, that I had realized that to create an organization would involve me in so many aspects that had nothing to do with music. But you know what saved me of that depression? I was reading something that everybody has to read, which is the epistolary, the correspondence of Beethoven in when he was spending time in the woods, and he wrote to the family. Do you know what Beethoven was doing the day that was premiering the same concert? Imagine, in the same concert, the 4th Symphony, the 5th Symphony, his 4th piano concerto, and he started the performance improvising on the piano. You know what he was doing that day? Selling tickets and putting posters all around Bonn. So, talking about empresarios, he actually organized his own concert. This is how composers would make sure that his music was played. They organized a concert. So when I read that, I said, I don't think I have to complain anything. Although I have to say that I wish that at some point the model, there is an intermediate model of supporting arts, which is an intermediate model of the extraordinary initiative in the United States, the individual philanthropy mission. Americans feel this duty to return to society that I hope Europeans learn. And at the same time, the government has to understand that culture is crucial too. I mean, of course, the priorities are in healthcare and education. So, you know, I think that would be the ideal situation so that I don't have to do so much work as a CEO.
Thank you.
Of course.
Any other questions? Phil, would you like to go on with the conversation for a little bit? Any other question for Ángel or anything you'd like to add?
Well, we didn't really wrap up, and maybe I can just ask you, Ángel, you know, you're at the 20th anniversary, and you're obviously filled with passion for this vocation that you have, and you have an audience that's loyal and enthusiastic, and you're discovering and pushing new frontiers now. So tell us a little bit about where you'd like to go and what you're thinking about either the seasons in the near future or in the more distant future.
Yeah. So to me, the crucial moment to understand the function of an orchestra within a community was also a phrase that I read from a very famous conductor at the end of the 19th century, Theodore Thomas, who said that an orchestra is a phenomenal reflection of the culture of a community. So post-classical ensemble has to reflect the Washington community, the same way that the Boston Symphony has to reflect the Boston community, that the New York Philharmonic has to reflect that community. And that's our mission as artists. We have to serve our community and at the same time challenge that community. But my goal right now, Phil, is we need to widen our audience. So how do we work? We have been working, I mean, we are making changes to make sure that we don't lose our intellectual component, but without becoming academic, or because that's not our place as an orchestra. University has that place. So we have to find that way of challenging our audiences, making sure that our audience is educated, but not marginalized or neglected, you know? So this is the way I want to go. What I want to go is to make sure that with this idea of contextualizing the work we do, we engage as many people as possible. This is the next 20 years.
Good. I think that's a very good way to finish. We're looking to the future, yes, but taking into account all the experience, this really important career, all the innovation that Ángel has brought with him to the States, and that you probably incorporated from the States as well, haven't you? Would you say you were influenced by what you saw here as well?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I always feel and I discuss is that what I learned in the United States is that a music director of an orchestra is basically an educator, going back to the idea of the community. And we had in the United States the best educator ever, who was a genius, Leonard Bernstein. The most extraordinary example of education, of musical education, are those young people's concerts of Leonard Bernstein, in which he talks to the kids as adults, not as, you know, even I would say children. They are children, but they are also adults. They have a wonderful minds. And I learned that. I learned that my mission as a conductor of an orchestra is also that of an educator. And this is why my obsession of widening our community, to making it accessible to as many people as possible.
Thank you very much. I think I'm just going to read some words which I will make mine from my colleague Richard Bueno, who is the director of the Instituto Cervantes in New York. And he says, excelente diálogo, mi más sincera enhorabuena. I think all those of us who being here today, listening to you both would agree with that. So thank you again, and congratulations for all this work, Ángel, and good luck for the program in the spring. And thank you, Philip, for preparing all this for you and for your brilliant questions and for the idea for this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Marta. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.